just about to start class. This this week we are talking about soil and dirt and plant nutrition and how that all works, so that you know how and why to treat the soil, when to feed plants and how to feed plants and why would you do that. Just to go by, just to talk about our classes coming up soon, we have native plant foods of Baja, Arizona next week, followed by container gardening, right plant, right place after that, and there's more classes too. You can go online. If you go to our website and click on online classes, that's where you will find all of our classes posted. And we're going to keep doing this for a little while at least. And it's actually a really good way to do the classes. We used to do them, at the nursery, and there's only so much room for so many people. And so this is a little easier. And plus, we can drink wine. So you can be in your underwear and it doesn't matter. So thanks, COVID. And Katie will be here. She will be watching your questions and answering your questions, or relaying those questions to me if they're appropriate for right away, or or whatever. Most of the questions regarding the class we answer right away, and if it's unrelated to the topic, then we do questions and answers after the class. So anyway, fire away questions anytime. If you are not on the actual YouTube app, or you can't see where to ask questions on YouTube, you can text it. The number's there on the screen there, so you can text the question too. And feel free to ask questions, because that's what this is all about, is interacting and figuring out all this stuff. Obviously I've been into plants for a long time, but some of what I've learned that informs my thinking nowadays came from studying with Elaine Ingham in Oregon. She is a microbiologist, and I spent, I used to work for Andrew Weil, and he sent me down there to spend some time looking through microscopes with her and learning how to make compost and learning a lot about nutrition. And I have to say that I'm heavily influenced by, which is very biological. The old school way of growing plants is a very chemical thing, and I don't come from that perspective. I come from the perspective of an ecologist. So let's get on with the class. So this class is called Digging Deep: Compost, Plant Nutrition, and Soil Ecology. And so we're going to go through all these subjects. So let's start off with how we traditionally grow plants. And when I say traditionally, I mean over the last 100 years. Or not even 100 years, really. It's kind of since World War II. After World War II, we really started using stuff that used to be used in war, so we turned all our ammonium nitrate into fertilizer instead of bombs, and then the chemical weapons that we were using on people, we turned towards. And so I think this was kind of a mistake, but it is something we already did. And the other plants too is outside of the understanding of ecology. So like in this picture here, I have a couple saguaros. They're all in their own little containers. And that's kind of how we treat plants. Like even when they're in the ground all together, we still think of them as in isolation from their environment. And that's what I want to get you away from thinking. Don't think of it. A plant doesn't exist all on its own. The results of traditional growing are not good. And it is a problem, and it's a catastrophe, to be honest, and it is something that we're trying to deal with, but we're sort of digging ourselves into a deeper hole. even with GMOs and all the technology we've come up with, we're still ending up with more salinity in the soil and toxicity. We're breeding plants to tolerate toxicity, but we're not saving our soils. The biodiversity is going down because you can't modify the genes of everything. So even if you're cool with the idea of modifying genes, which I don't personally have an issue with, my thing is that you can't alter the genes of every living organism on Earth. And when you have a toxic situation and you've bred your plant to tolerate that, and maybe a bee species, you can't modify the genetics of every single organism that comes into contact with what you're growing, and that's the problem. And so biodiversity is going down, toxicity and salinity is going up, nutrient and water holding capacity in the soil is going down, and structural integrity, obviously, of the soil, erosion is going up. So not good results from our traditional methods of farming. And I talk about farming a lot when I'm talking about horticulture and growing plants in your backyard too, because all the products that we have to grow stuff, well, not all of them, but a lot of them that are available in the big markets are products that came from agriculture. So it's very relevant to what we're talking about. But plants don't live in isolation. Plants develop with other organisms. They evolve with other organisms. So their needs and their way of living has evolved with the organisms all around them, not just like the pollinators as suggested in this photo, but the microorganisms in the soil. And that's very important when you're thinking about growing plants and when you're approaching plant nutrition. So that's the perspective that we're coming from. And we're going to be talking about, of course, mostly about soil. So there's a host of organisms that live in the soil, and they all have their role. Some of them really annoy us. People hate ants. Ants, when they come and they pull the leaves off your plants. Most people don't like that experience. But something to know about things, they pull all that nutrition into the soil, and they aerate the soil, and the plants come back, and sometimes they look better than they looked before. So and that's the case too with when a moth larvae defoliates your ash tree, or caterpillar defoliates your plant. Most of the time, unless the plant's brand new, most of the time plants come back. And even when they're brand new, they mostly come back. The plants have evolved with these organisms. And they depend on this too. Like, when a plant is defoliated by caterpillars, the caterpillars are also pooping on the ground. And that feeds the ground. And the ants take it underground, and various other organisms are improving the soil. So the first step is really to stop looking at other organisms as intruders in your garden. The only intruder is us. And so I say that a lot, and it sounds like I'm hating on humans, and sometimes I am. But for the most part, what I really want you to get to the perspective I want you to have is that these organisms mostly belong here, and they have a role. And so most of the problems that we have is because of what we've done interrupting those processes, especially when we first build a house, when we plow, we bulldoze the soil. So anyway, our goal is to get you to bring this back, to bring back the biology in the soil. So let's talk a little bit about fertilizers real quick, and we're going to get a little deeper into them later too. But just as a general difference between synthetic and organic fertilizers is something you should know. So synthetic fertilizers, let's talk about organic fertilizers actually. Let's talk about the real stuff first. Because this is how plants get their nutrition. So, organic fertilizers we put into the ground, it's not a plant food. It works slower. You're not going to see most of the time an immediate response from organic fertilizers, because what they do is they go into the soil, and the soil takes the material, and the soil doesn't take the organisms that live in the soil take that material and turn it into food for plants. And they're not even doing that per se. What they're doing is just living. They're eating and they're pooping and they're reproducing, and the byproducts of their lives feed plants. So that's how organic fertilizers work. Synthetic fertilizers like Miracle-Gro or ammonium phosphate or ammonium nitrate, these are like either mined or synthetic fertilizers, and they tend to be high concentration of nutrients, and they go directly to the plant. They do nothing for the soil. Actually, they do something for the soil. They kill the organisms in the soil, because most synthetic fertilizers are heavy salts, and heavy salts dehydrate and kill microorganisms. So for the most part, you want to really try to stay away from them, because if you're trying to go an organic way of feeding plants, because they're sort of going to detract from the from what you're trying to do. And also beware, especially in the big corporate nurseries and garden centers and stuff. They'll have products that look organic, but they're not. And how do you tell? Well, read the ingredients, but also if the numbers on the fertilizer are kind of high, and they're promising immediate results, what a lot of these companies like to do is that they know, it's called greenwashing, but they know that people want to do organic things, and so they make organic fertilizers, but then they slip in a little ammonium phosphate, because they do know that people really like to see immediate responses to their care. People like to, do something and see the plant immediately respond. And that's nice and all, but it's also sort of fooling yourself, because you're really not, you're helping the plant immediately, but you're sort of destroying the soil. And so so try to stay away from those fertilizers that have the high numbers, and we'll go over how to look for that. But one thing I want you to be aware of when we're talking about soil biology and plant nutrition and compost and why we're doing all this, I want you to go back to whenever you learned, 8th grade biology or whenever you had biology. And I don't know if you learned about succession, but succession is a process where after usually a catastrophe, fire or lava flows or a meteorite or whatever it is, or human activity, after usually an event like that, or if you go back to the beginning of the planet, you have a sterile substrate. And what happens is organisms move in that can live in that situation. And most of them are microorganisms that can feed on rocks, basically. And they can, and some of them photosynthesize. And so in the beginning of succession, the beginning of a piece of land going from nothing to old growth forest, you start off, with these microorganisms, and then it evolves into lichens, and then very simple non-vascular plants like mosses, and then as time goes on, these are small organisms, and they do put some organic material in the soil, and so as they're living and dying and stuff over a long period of time, organic material starts to build in the soil, and as a consequence, new organisms show up. And so then you get into your annual weeds and plants that are what they call pioneer plants. And pioneer plants have their own biomass, and so and the insects that come along with them. And as time goes on, more and more organic material is going into the soil. And then at some point, the plants start to get woody, and that's a very important it's a very important thing that happens in succession because of what happens in soil. So in the beginning of succession, first of all, there's like no microorganisms, and the first things to show up, of course, bacteria. And the bacteria, as time goes on and the nutrition's building up into the soil, the organic materials building up in the soil, the bacteria starts to diversify. You get more and more species and more complicated species. Wood shows up when you get woody shrubs and more carbon, which, plants that are woody produce more carbon as opposed to nitrogen. You start to see fungus. So the fungus starts to show up, and then you get closer you get to an old growth forest, the more fungus you end up that ends up in the soil, and the bacteria is still there, it just gets more and more diverse. And by the time you are in old growth forest, you have a diverse spectrum of of fungus and bacteria and protozoans and other microorganisms, microarthropods, which are teeny tiny insects, and of course insects and mammals. And the life starts to it's not just the trees that get bigger, it's everything that gets bigger. So that's succession. And the reason I want you to think about this is because whatever plant you're trying to grow fits somewhere into this situation. A lot of the plants that we grow for food, especially like our winter in Arizona, our winter herbs and vegetables and stuff, are weeds. So, almost all of our vegetables are lettuce and cabbage, not lettuce, but all our cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower. It's actually a whole one species, Brassica oleracea, and it's a weed. And a lot of those plants are weeds. Some of the more perennial crops or tropical plants are a little bit higher up in the succession, but they're still in the middle, There are some crops that do come from old growth forest, strawberries. So strawberries really like a fungal soil, whereas your cauliflower likes a very bacterial soil. So this is going to make more sense in why we're talking about this as we start talking about compost and everything. But I just want you to understand succession and what the significance of it when it comes to soil nutrition. So this is what an old growth forest looks like, in the Pacific Northwest. And we have this kind of thing here. You go up into the mountains and we have old growth forests. It doesn't look exactly like that, but it looks a lot like that, and it's kind of amazing. But also, this is old growth forest too. And even people who study this stuff sometimes misunderstand the desert, and they think that this is a disturbed landscape. They actually kind of they log it in the earlier part of succession. But if you actually look at the microbiology of our soil, while it isn't very deep, like in an old growth forest is very, very deep soil full of microbes, our soil is thin, but it is still very diverse. And those saguaro cactus and ocotillos, that overgrowth is our old growth. And if you look at the soil biology of the desert, it's very diverse. Lots of weird plants grow in, if you go up into the Tucson Mountains and you see these species of plants that actually can't live without those microbes. Lots of ferns and other plants that are, there's these parasitic plants that really depend on all these microbes to live in the soil. These are our old growth forests, and so and while a lot of it is being disturbed, they're naturally our saguaro forests are old growth. So I want you to remember that and picture this every time you see an untouched saguaro forest. Remember, they're as precious as the redwoods. So how do we approximate succession? Like, how do we go, when you move into your house, you're not dealing with native soil. There are a lot of people who say that you don't need to add compost into the ground when you plant native plants. We very much disagree with this because you're not dealing with native soil, you're dealing with disturbed soil. And so you need to do something to sort of approximate the biology that should be there. And so what we do is we add compost, and sometimes we add organic foods into the soil. So that's kind of what we're doing when we add compost. And how much you add and what kind and all that is dependent on where your plant falls in succession. But don't think of the desert as a disturbed landscape, because it isn't. Riparian areas are actually kind of disturbed landscapes, but that's a whole other subject. So yeah, compost is how we're going to add that nutrition in. And let's this is a gross approximation. When we talk about bringing back the biology in the soil, you're not going to bring back what used to be there. It's gone, and that's a sad thing. And that's why we should try to preserve as much of what's ever left out there as we can, because it is not something that you can bring back. It is forever gone. However, we can approximate what used to be there and bring back a lot of the flora and bring back some biology. And it might not be exactly what used to be there before, but it is something. And so it's important to do. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about compost. Some of you might not be able to compost. And if you can't, then it's fine to buy commercial compost. Or maybe you know someone who can compost. I will say this, commercial compost will never be as good as the compost you make at home. Compost at home compost at home, even if you do a crappy job, is still way better than the stuff in the commercial industry, because in the industry they have to make products consistent. There's things that there's what's the word I'm trying to find? There's needs that they have to keep things shelf stable. And so something as alive as a real good compost is not something that's really something that you can easily put into a Home Depot. So so you won't find that, you're not going to have as good of an experience with commercial compost as you will with your own. So if you can compost, do it. And like I said, even if you do a crappy job, you're still going to have a better result than commercial compost. So, and then also we'll talk about using organic fertilizers, which is another way of getting around all this. But we're going to talk about compost and how to make it. So you have green waste and brown waste, and in general, this is very generalized. But the green waste is the green stuff, and it's the stuff that doesn't have the wood in it. And as we talked about back in the succession, the green stuff is nitrogen rich, and it's there to feed bacteria. The brown stuff is the stuff that has lignous growth in it, or woody growth in it, which is full of carbon, and that feeds fungus. So you want a mix of this in your compost. And there's other reasons you want the mix of carbon and nitrogen, even if you're not trying to create a super fungal mix. The more carbon you have in your compost, the less stinky it is. And you do want some, because you don't want to have... we got a squeaky door. You don't want to... You don't want your mix to be too carbonous or too nitrogenous, because if it's too much nitrogen, too much green waste, it'll get anaerobic and stinky. If it gets too much carbon or brown waste, you end up with a compost that doesn't really move, right? So anyway, we're gonna, your goal, you have to play around with your ingredients, and everyone gets a hold of different ingredients, but you want to have a balance of these things, and you can feel it out by looking at it. Compost should always smell. I mean, there are times when it does smell funky, but it shouldn't smell funky for a long time, and you want to make sure that it's well mixed up. That you try to have a balance between the green and the brown waste, and having manure in there is very important. That's what really gets it going. If you have manure in your compost, and that's sort of a third category, although it's really more of a green waste, but it's also an inoculant. It brings in a lot of microbes into your compost and fires it up and gets it heated up. And you want that. The compost is going to heat up kind of impressively, and we'll talk about that. But you want to get a balance of green waste, a balance of carbon and green waste, and then you want to get your manure. Water is very important, and oxygen are very important. So there's kind of the 5 ingredients, right? Green waste, brown waste, manure, water, and oxygen. Now, what combination of these things you have is something you have to feel out. In general, people have always said in thirds between green waste, brown waste, and manure. It's not always going to work out exactly as we want it to, and especially in our climate, which is a hotter climate. It also depends on what kind of manure you get. Chicken manure is way hotter than horse manure, which is very not as active. So, and if the compost has been sitting around, or if the manure has been sitting around, or it's been heat treated, then it's not going to have that same firing mechanism that fresh manure will have. Fresh manure you would never put directly onto your plants because it will burn your plants, and it's salty and it's hot. So you want to put your manure into your compost. It helps calm it down, and it helps unlock all that stuff that's in all of these things, in the green waste, the brown waste, and manure, to feed your plants. So, but let's just say, to start off, in thirds, green waste, brown waste, manure, enough water so you make a fistful, and it'll stay as a ball, but it's not sopping wet. So you want enough to create some structure, but you don't want it to be sopping wet, because you also want the oxygen. If you don't have enough oxygen, then it gets anaerobic. Anaerobic activity smells like poop or vomit. It smells really gross. And so you don't want that. You want oxygen in there. And all the things that we're trying to raise in our soil, all the beneficial organisms, tend to be aerobic. There's always some anaerobic activity in all of this, in your soil, in your compost, and that's going to eliminate all anaerobic activity. But in general, you want aerobic activity to dominate your compost pile. I hope I'm not losing anyone so far, but so far it doesn't look like we've had too many questions. So you get your compost together, and you find poop. Everyone has. There's always someone with a horse that has more poop than they know what to do with. If you can also buy manure in nurseries. A lot of the time, the nursery manure is not very hot. They know that people are trying to use it right away, so they try not to put fresh manure in there. But it can help. Bat guano is not going to be a good activator because it's kind of a different thing. Bat guano you can put on sort of directly onto your plants. You can treat it more like earthworm castings. And earthworm castings also not the kind of poop you're looking for when it comes to this kind of compost. You're looking for, chicken, cow, goat manure is really good. Lots of, like the domestic animals. They say not to use, your pet, cat and dog poop or human poop. I'm going to tell you probably not to do that, but I'm going to say this: poop is poop. And the prejudices that people have about manure and disease comes from our traditional agriculture system, which is sort of unhealthy. So I'll tell you this. I have an entire book on Japan and the history of Japan and their agriculture. And people were studying Japan when they first opened up to the West, because they couldn't figure out how does this island with a giant population feed all its people. They couldn't figure it out because in the West we would have destroyed those soils a long time ago, and they did a lot of research to try to figure out what was going on. Well, in Japan they recycled manure, including human manure, and so all manure went back into the agriculture system to feed the soil. They had a sustainable system. And I think, unfortunately, some of that technology went away and people went more towards traditional agriculture. But a lot of people still do it sort of the traditional way. I don't know if they use human manure anymore, but that is also one of the reasons that a lot of Japanese were vegetarians, because vegetarian manure is way more better for the agriculture system than way more better. Yes.
Couple questions.
Yes.
If you go too far anaerobic, you can simply add more carbon, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So if you are starting to get stinky, not you, but your compost, then there's two things you can do. Yes, add more carbon or more woody stuff. Straw is sufficient for that, even though straw is not technically wood, but it'll help. But adding in straw or wood or shredded paper, actually, as long as it's not the glossy paper, almost all the inks that are used these days in most printing, especially like newsprint, is soy-based, and that is organic. So that is something that can go into your compost. Don't use glossy paper. Definitely don't use receipt paper. In fact, if you can never touch receipts again, don't. That ink and paper is really toxic. But newspaper and printed paper from your printer is fine. It's all soy-based.
Human hair in compost?
Human hair is amazing. In fact, any kind of hair is amazing. Cat hair, human hair. Feathers. Hair has a high phosphorus content. So hair is really great. If you know a hairdresser, you should steal their hair. Kind of creepy, but I'd do it.
What about hormones or antibiotics that might be in the manure?
So we can't entirely get away from the agriculture system, but I will say this, and this is something that we'll talk about a little later too. The process of composting is mimicking what happens in our soil, but basically, like, decomposition is one of the things that can actually save us from a lot of the mess we've made. The forming of humic acids. We're going to get into this more, like I said, but making humus or humic acids is what you're doing when you make compost. And basically what happens is you're breaking down things until they can't be broken down anymore. And the end result are humic substances, which are organic substances that are like, they're like polymers. They behave like a polymer, which is like plastic, but this is natural. And these humic substances are very good for plants and very good for biology. And then they can't be broken down anymore. Basically, it's the lowest you can break down an organic substance. And that process can unlock even heavy metals. It can unlock and it's the right way to put this. Take the most toxic things and make them not toxic. So there's like a lot of hope in this this idea of organic growing. People are looking into mushrooms too, by the way, in terms of detoxing soil and even nuclear waste sites. So biology is kind of amazing. So anyway, when it comes to that, those hormones and stuff actually are one of the easiest things to break down, and even some of those pesticides in a compost pile, like a lot of that stuff gets broken down into inert substances. So you don't have to worry so much about that kind of stuff. It's always around us. There's no way you can get away from it anymore. Plastic is everywhere. There's a lot of agriculture chemicals that are going to be kind of in our lives, and there's nothing we can do about it. Drink green tea. We just like do, cancer preventative stuff.
Somebody asks, they're using a large plastic tub as their compost bin, and they have many cockroaches. Should they be concerned?
No, they gross people out because our association with cockroaches has to do with the sewer. We have a lot of native cockroaches in Arizona. You're going to probably have some in your compost. They're not a big deal. I've never seen them be a problem. We have, in our compost pile, we'll have some of those cockroaches. They don't get into our house. They'll be around. Their job is to break down, they're one of the good guys. They break down detritus into, smaller pieces for microbes to work on. So they're part of that system. Now I'll say this: your compost, in the way, especially if you do it right, it's going to heat up, and so that heating process will also eliminate a lot of those cockroach problems. But you're going to have some. Don't be too afraid of that.
Someone who's been composting with just green and brown plant material seems to be working. Is it completely useless to compost that way without manure?
No, it's not useless. It's slower, and it might not be quite as rich. But then it depends on what you're doing. I mean, if you have a lot of coffee grounds in there, then that helps. Another thing to add in that acts like an activator, like manure does, is fish. And I know they always tell you not to put meat in a compost, but there's always exceptions, and one of those is fish. Now, you don't put a whole fish in there, but if you can stomach doing this, you cut up. If you have some fish scraps, let's say you made some halibut for dinner, and you cut off the skin and the tail and stuff. If you take that and blend it up and then add water, basically that's fish emulsion, by the way. But without the sulfur, they put sulfur in fish emulsion to keep it stable on a shelf so it doesn't blow up all over the place. Sulfur is actually antimicrobial. So, but anyway, grind up your fish and put it in your compost pile, and that's an activator, much like manure is. Not because it comes with a lot of bacteria, but because it attracts a lot of that bacteria and it gets that pile fired up. So anyway, but if you're not even doing that, though, that's fine. If you're just doing green and brown waste and you're still coming out with a product that you like, it takes a little longer, and it might not be quite as rich, but it's still fine. And like I said, adding things like a lot of coffee grounds, and it just all depends on what you're putting in there. But like I said, even if you do the crappiest compost, it's better than the commercial compost. So it's good that you're composting, and you use what you get. You're not always going to have all these ingredients at once, too, and that's not something to worry so much about. When we do our pile, we just sort of have that. I've always done it as an open pile, but recently we had this giant. What do you call those things? The bin we put our compost in. Oh gosh,
like a feed tank.
Yeah, feed tank. We have a stock tank. It's a Rubbermaid stock tank, and a friend of mine had it, and they were going down the freeway, and it wasn't quite attached very well to the truck, and I guess it blew out and cracked, and so anyway, it wasn't good for their intended use, was to use in an aquaponic system, but since it's cracked down the side, it wasn't good for that. I started using it for compost, and it's been great. When you do a compost pile, you want to have the ability to move stuff around. You want a big space. Those little tumblers, don't waste money on those things. I mean, unless you're just doing a little bit of compost, and it's probably okay. But there's a lot of things that people try to sell that you don't need to buy stuff for this kind of thing. The best thing is just open ground, a space on the ground where you make a pile, and you can turn the pile around. You can get your pitchfork or shovel underneath it and turn it and move it around. So anyway, as you're gathering your ingredients, like in our stock tank, we just throw the ingredients in there, and we get to a point usually where we're having a larger influx of materials. In our case, we've gone through different things. Sometimes we get spent grain from Borderlands Brewery or other breweries. When they make beer, one of the byproducts is the grain that they use to make the beer. It actually happens to be really good chicken food. In fact, one of the best things you can feed your chickens, better than the store-bought food. But we usually end up with way more than we can possibly feed our chickens, so we usually compost it. Coffee grounds, of course, are great, and you can sometimes get a cafe to save them for you. Starbucks is actually kind of famous for that. I don't really like Starbucks myself, but at least they're good at, saving those grounds for you. And then sometimes, it's the end of the season in the garden and we're pulling out a lot of materials. Or sometimes we're trimming our trees and we end up with more things. So as you're gathering up these ingredients, you're going to mix them in. And then really the thing that's going to fire that up is adding the manure. I mean, it is going to be composting anyway. But once you add that manure in and you're adding the water in, and again managing the oxygen in the compost pile, it'll start to fire up. And so you're mixing up the ingredients, you add the manure in, and then you have this heating process. And this is usually when you add the manure. The manure is really what fires this up. Now, if you're doing that slower compost, you're not going to see this temperature rise quite as much. But with the manure, it'll get hot, and sometimes it can even be smoking. You can see it smoke. You want to keep the temperature between 135 and 160. If it starts to get above 160 or 170, you're going to take a pitchfork or a shovel or something and break the pile up. Once you add that oxygen in a little bit and move the pile around, it'll disturb it, and the temperature will go back down a little bit, and then it'll start to rise again. And but just try not to keep the pile too hot for too long, or else you end up with anaerobic activity, because too much heat and too much. I think of it almost as like a fire, you know. It's going to burn up the oxygen. It's going to suck out all that oxygen. So, maintain that temperature between those temperatures. Now, if your temperature doesn't get quite that hot, but it gets, let's say it gets to 130 for a while, and then it goes back down after a while, then it's probably done its job. But it is really good if you can get it up to about 150 or 160. That's a pretty ideal, and it will stop after a while, because what's happening? The microbes are actually digesting all that organic material. They're converting it into smaller pieces, and it's essentially going to be plant food. So and once they've had that spike of activity, that spike of population and spike of their life activities, then they decrease and go into catalyst. A lot of these organisms they go into sort of like a dormancy period, and so the activity that heats up the pile is just microbes living their lives. So once they sort of go dormant, that pile cools down, and once that pile cools down and then it maintains a temperature, then you're going to see then you're going to be able to use that compost, and then it's pretty much ready, and you can see and smell when it's ready.
Somebody's asking, they have the space to do because they have pack rats, ground squirrels, etc.
Mm-hmm. So animals can be an issue with the compost, because they like a lot of that stuff in there too. So it all depends on it. You have to kind of manage your own tolerance for these sorts of things, and how you manage those things. You might, let's say you have a pack rat issue. Actually, pack rats, they'll get into the pile, but pack rats make nests elsewhere. They like to take stuff out of the compost and take it back to their nest. So they're not as much an issue, but you might get mice. And we have had little mice in our compost. But of course, we kind of have mice anyway because we have chickens. We keep them out of the house. Again, if you do that hot pile, you'll have less of that issue, because when that pile is 160 degrees, it's not something that animals want to live in. You are going to attract animals, so you will have birds are going to go in there, and that's kind of like one of the reasons I do it, to be honest. I actually kind of don't mind that activity, because a lot of what I want to do in my yard is probiology. Now, when you live in an urban area, sometimes, you don't want to attract that kind of thing. We live in a suburban neighborhood, and our activities don't seem to affect our neighbors. They're not bothered by our activity. I don't think, the little mice that live, they basically kind of live off the chicken food, extra chicken food, and then sometimes they go into the compost pile. They haven't really been an issue for us. In terms of like being a problem. In fact, I don't even think they've ever gone into the garden. Maybe once we had something eat a plant, but like hasn't been an issue. So again, I'm always going to go back to telling you we're going pro biology. We're trying to encourage biology, and that means they're going to have biology in the pile. So and it all depends on where you live. Like some people really do have a lot more biology in their area, and so it all depends on what if you're trying not to attract snakes and stuff. I get it, although I like snakes. They keep the mice down.
Yeah, we need snakes.
Whenever people ask us like how do I control we have a pat rack spike, I always tell them let the snakes come back. I know that's not really what people want to hear, but anyway, yeah. You're always managing this balance between you and your human activities and biology, and how much give and take are you willing to do. And so, we probably give a little more than most people do, but I'll tell you this, we don't have a problem in our house with things. Things don't come into our house. We haven't had any issues with, not even snakes, to be honest, but we had a snake in our yard once, and it kind of went away. But, yeah, that's all I have to say about that, I think. If I didn't quite answer your question, elaborate. But that's about what I'm going to have to say. So, this is just a pile of compost, which is a lot of manure in here, but you can see how that heats up. It can heat up really hot. Fires have started because of manure. So, manure is a very high nitrogen thing. The big unfortunate incident that happened in Beirut was ammonium nitrate, which I think they were using for fireworks, that blew up. Ammonium nitrate's also fertilizer. Fertilizer has blown up in places when it hasn't been stored properly. So, that's a synthetic form of it, but it's serious stuff. So, this stuff heats up. It's kind of amazing. There's also a method of composting where you compost in the place that you're going to put plants. And I kind of like doing this. We have 4 or 5 garden beds that we rotate. I say 4 or 5 because we actually have 4, and then we have kind of 2 on the side that are smaller. So actually kind of have 6. But between the 4, though, we do what we call in situ composting, which is we let that bed lay fallow for a while and compost directly into that bed. And so, and then when it's done doing its thing, we turn it into the soil more, and it's ready to plant directly in. So that's another way to think about composting too, is you might compost in a place that you're going to do some planting. And I'm not just talking about gardens. Like you can do that with a bed that you might plant some shrubs or something. This is just a pile of spent grain, that we were sharing with friends who also had chickens and wanted to feed chickens. And so we were feeding our chickens from this pile, but we were also composting it. And I have to say, this stuff is really good. We were using a commercial compost for a while that we got a truckload of that was kind of highly alkaline, and a lot of people had problems with it, and we didn't. And the reason we didn't is because we were mixing this in there too, which is, this stuff is actually really acidic, and so it was very beneficial for our soils, which are very alkaline. So this is just kind of a graphic to just show you that about 30 days that it's really it depends on the ingredients you put into the pile and the timing that you put the ingredients in the pile and how well you manage it. Sometimes it can be even shorter than 30 days, but in general, you're turning all this stuff into compost. Finished compost, your aim is for it to look sort of like that rich brown color, that like coffee grounds, like dark coffee, and you don't want it black. There's this belief that black soil is a really great thing. Black actually is not a great color when it comes to compost, at least, because it's sort of a sign of anaerobic activity, that the anaerobic activity has occurred. Now, this is separate from the black soils that they have in some parts of the country, which I think is volcanic, which is really great for things like potatoes or whatever. I think the Hudson Valley has Hudson Valley, New York has black soil, and that's different. That's a geological influence in the soil. But in your compost, you don't want your compost to be black. You want it to be coffee ground brown, and that's that color that's producing those humic substances.
Well, and you'll smell it too.
And
It'll smell good.
It'll smell, yeah. It won't smell poopy or swampy. It'll smell earthy. It smells sweet. Yeah, it smells really good. Compost smells amazing. So there's something we call compost tea, and this was actually kind of the specialty that Elaine Ingham, who trained me in a lot of this stuff. This is sort of her pet project. It's called aerated compost tea, and I used to do this commercially too. I worked for another company called Merlin Organics for a little while, and we made commercial compost tea for the U of A. We're trying to get them to go green and not use pesticides and synthetic fertilizers on their lawns, and on that green strip right down the middle. That was our test plot. And so we made I made compost tea for that, and my system looked very much like this. These commercial containers, and this is kind of expensive equipment, but you can do it at home, and there's fairly cheap ingredients. Even this little setup here is kind of fancy compared to what you can do it. You can use just an air stone and not this fancy aerator that we have in here. But a 5-gallon bucket is sufficient. You get a bag of tea. A bag of compost. These are the things that go into a compost tea. Actually, let's back up a little bit. Why are we making compost tea, and what is it? So compost tea is you take a good batch of compost, and you add you put it in water, and you add a food and oxygen, and when I say food, bacterial and fungal food, and then oxygen, and you brew it over a 12 to 24 hour period. What you do is you create a super rich microbial inoculant, and the resulting tea can be added to your soil and to the tops of plants to protect them, and it's beneficial. It's very, very healthy for plants. So we'll get into that, but the compost tea, basically the ingredients is compost in a like a tea bag. It's like usually a nylon bag. These are all things you can look up online and get. An activator is the food, microbial food, whether bacterial, fungal, or both. And we'll talk about that. Oxygen, non-chlorinated water, which means that you're going to have to put the water in your bucket and aerate the water before you put anything else in there. Usually if you do it over a couple hours even, it gets rid of the chlorine. The chlorine, dissipates. But those are the basic ingredients. This is sort of one of the aerators that you can find. I think these things cost like $80 or something like that. But they put a lot of oxygen in that bucket, and oxygen is what you really want for a good compost tea. Molasses is the standard thing that people use for a bacterial food. Backstrap molasses is unsulfured. You don't want sulfured molasses. Again, sulfur is antimicrobial, so you want unsulfured backstrap molasses. And it's just like there's measurements. I put a bloop. Okay, just do a bloop. But you put some molasses in there, and another standard ingredient is kelp powder, and that's the fungal food. Kelp is a really good fungal food. So you add these things into your compost tea brew with the oxygen, the water, the compost, the kelp, and the molasses, and you brew it in a 12 to 24 hour period. The microbes that are in that compost just breed like crazy because there's all that food and all that oxygen. And this substrate, this water substrate that normally wouldn't be good, it would be anaerobic, but you're pumping oxygen into this water. So the populations of these microbes explode, and you have this super dense inoculant. So, and here's a little picture of those little these little bags that are nylon bags, 400 micro mesh bags, and they're like $8 or something like that, I think. If you don't have this, just use a cloth bag, or use a cheesecloth or something. It's you don't have to get fancy about it, and it doesn't matter if it breaks out of the bag. Like you're not drinking this stuff. It's not like it just makes it a little more inconvenient to apply when you have a bunch of grit in there. You actually don't even need the bag if you don't care. So you're going to apply this tea not just to the soil, but you're going to apply it to the tops of the plant. Now we're going to talk about what they just call the phyllosphere and the phyllosphere and the rhizosphere. Oh, question?
Do you need to use a bag?
You don't need to use a bag. It just makes it more convenient for you to put that resulting tea into something that you can spray. That's why people use a bag. But you don't have to. You can just pour it into the soil, and there's grit. Who cares? So the bag is not that important. When you're talking about the populations of microbes that are everywhere, in the plant world, they're in what you call the phyllosphere and the rhizosphere. The rhizosphere, is the dirt, is the soil portion, and in and around plant roots. And so these are the organisms that live in and around the roots and do beneficial things, or sometimes not beneficial things, for the plant. The phyllosphere is the top of the plants, the surfaces of the branches and leaves, and believe it or not, that every single surface of every organism is covered in microbes. And this goes back to what we were kind of saying before, but like being pro-biology means getting over yourself. You're not the only thing that lives in the universe, and you're covered in these bugs too. The human behavior towards biology has been negative, and everything we do is just to decrease this stuff. But it's been not good for us, and I'll tell you why. In the plant world, if you do things to the rhizosphere and the phyllosphere that kill microbes, which we do a lot of, you kill everything. And that means you kill the beneficial stuff and the innocuous stuff. Innocuous means organisms that don't do anything positive or negative, they just exist. But even organisms that are innocuous have a purpose. On a plant, whether it's the rhizosphere or the phyllosphere, the roots or the top of the plant, in nature, a healthy organism is covered in organisms. And it just happens to be that most of the bad stuff, the stuff that kills our plants, are opportunistic organisms that don't really like a lot of competition, right? So what happens when you get rid of the competition? You end up with problems. And this is what we do in agriculture. We actually make our problems worse. So by the way that we feed plants and the way that we control pests, we're constantly opening up these empty spaces for more pests to come in, opportunistic organisms who occupy empty spaces. If your plant is covered in beneficial organisms and innocuous organisms, they bud out those opportunistic organisms. They take up the space that those opportunistic organisms want. And opportunistic organisms tend to be weak creatures. They tend to go to places where there's not a lot of competition. So when you take that compost tea that's full of these mostly beneficial or innocuous organisms, and you put them on the surface of the plant, and you put them in the soil, you're adding beneficial and innocuous organisms. You're also taking up space to bud out and push out opportunistic organisms. So you're making a healthy biome, and that's what our goal is, right? So also there's nutritional value to composty as well. There's always a little bit left in there, and especially like right before you apply it to the soil, if you like add in a little more molasses or add in a little more kelp powder or whatever you're using, then you're also feeding at the same time and getting that burst of activity. So good thing to do. But anyway, that's a very important thing we just talked about right there, because that is something that it tells you a lot about what we do wrong, and it also tells you about what we can do right. And it's again being very pro biology and bringing back systems to be healthy and functional. So yeah, these other there's other microbiomes too that we didn't really discuss as much. There's microbes that just live in the air. There's microbes that live inside the plant too, and that actually is fairly important too. And a lot of the stuff that we're doing is good for that. That's what some of that other terminology is on that little chart. But basically, what I want you to think about is the entire plant surface, not just the roots, is important when you're talking about beneficial microbes. Now, people always, of course, ask about vermicompost or worm composting. This is a totally different system than what we just talked about. You're using the worms to compost for you, and so then you use what are called red wiggler worms. They're not native, but they're here now, and they don't cause any problems in our ecosystem. But a lot of people do it in their house. In fact, this is a picture of a system we did a few years ago. It's just 2 tubs. The reason we have 2 tubs is, there's a resulting moisture that's pulled out when you do vermicompost. You get what they call worm juice, and so you're adding in a lot less green waste. You want to have a high carbon mix for worms because you don't want the pile to heat up. Even a little bit of green waste, even if there's not a lot or no manure in that pile, it can still heat up. So you don't want too much of that. You want shredded newspaper is what a lot of people use, or straw, and then moisture, but not so much. Same thing. You want oxygen in there. And then your green waste, and you throw in your green waste. With worm compost, you don't want too much green waste. What are you whining about? This is our dog, one of them. That's Ethel. Say hi, Ethel. So vermicompost or worm compost is the activity of worms breaking this stuff down for you, and when it's done because it just looks like rich compost. This is a system we have outside. Now, it's harder to do worms outside because, especially in the summertime, a lot of the worms will go dormant or just look like they totally disappear. Although ours are pretty active still. This is actually an old bathtub, and there's a drain, so the moisture all goes through the drain, and we just take, when it fills up we have a tray that collects the water, we just pour that on some plants. On the top there is just some cardboard to keep the sun and the air off the pile, but there's worms in there, and there's actually it's on our drip irrigation too, so there's moisture that's constantly put in there, and so it's kept moderately moist. The worms don't go totally dormant in the summertime, but the activity goes down, and then in the wintertime they're very active. And then the other thing too is that we can add we could do compost first, and then from the compost, this is actually that Rubbermaid thing that I was telling you about. There's a crack down the side somewhere in there. But this is us gathering the materials. But after you compost, you can actually take compost from your compost pile and put it in the vermicompost or your worm compost, and then they break it down and make it even more richer and amazing. And so now we're going to go on to the subject of organic fertilizers. So not everyone can compost, and even if you do compost, sometimes you need more for whatever reason. Maybe you don't have the right ingredients. Maybe you your soil is alkaline, or you have some geology in your soil that makes it a little harder, and it's harder to get certain nutrients. That's when you're going to add fertilizers. Someone had a question.
Does the time of year, hot versus cold, affect compost pile?
Yes. Now you can compost any time of year, but obviously in the summertime it's going to get hotter quicker. So another thing I didn't talk about is we actually cover our compost pile with a tarp, or sometimes hay and a tarp to decrease evaporations, just so we don't have to water the thing so much. But anyway, the compost pile, you can compost any time of year, really, but you just have to manage that heat a little quicker in the summertime, and you might add possibly a little less manure in the summertime too. And also when you're creating compost tea, I forgot to mention this too. When you make compost tea, you brew it in the temperature that you're going to apply it. So you can make compost tea in the summertime, although they say that the best temperature for compost tea is in the 80s, and we haven't seen that temperature in a while. So unless you're out there applying this stuff at night, don't worry about that. You can still make compost tea, and it's still going to be very beneficial. The people who say those kind of things, all this technology that we're talking about, the composting, the compost tea, a lot of this research came from Oregon. They're very different than us. And again, they see our soil and they think our soil is disturbed, and they think our desert is void of life. So, it's a misunderstanding of the biology, even though they're biologists. But some of them, not all of them, but some of them don't know that much about desert ecology, and so they see us. A lot of I know some of you have friends that, when you moved here, if you are not from here, thought that you moved to a place with sand dunes. That's what people picture when they say you live in the desert. But of course, that's not what we have. Anyway, compost tea can be made any time of year too. It is better in the wintertime. It's going to be more diverse. If you have a microscope, start looking at your compost tea and compost in your microscope, and you can start to look at what you're doing. And in general, this would be an entire class, and I don't even think I'm necessarily equipped to teach something like this. This is something you go to Oregon and learn from Elaine Ingham, but you can learn to identify the microorganisms in the soil. I've learned how to do the basic. You're not going to learn species, because even the people who study this stuff don't know that. But you can identify the difference between bacteria, nematodes, and most nematodes are good, fungal strands. You learned how to identify the differences in a microscope, and when those of us who do this professionally know how to look at that stuff and then adjust our recipes. So you don't have to do this with a microscope. You could just kind of wing it, and winging it is good enough, and is what organic farmers have been doing forever. They never looked through microscopes before. So you don't have to do that, and it's kind of overkill. But some of you who are nerds out there, and I'm one of them, so hi nerds. If you get a microscope, it's kind of fun to look at this stuff in the microscope and see the results of what you're doing. When you add more kelp into your compost tea, you'll start to see more of the fungal strands, which are these thicker strands, especially the aerobic fungus are these fat strands that are really cool to look at. And then you see all the little protozoans, and if you're lucky, you could see one of those. What are those things called? That everyone talks about them all the time. Those weird little animals. Can't think of the name of them.
Don't know.
They look like little. Someone comment. I know someone knows what I'm talking about. Those little organisms that everyone talks about that look like little pigs or something.
Little pigs?
I mean, I can't think of the name. Anyway, it's amazing. When you start looking at a microscope, it's addicting, because there's a lot of critters down there, and they all have their own little mechanisms for mobility, and anyway, it's fun. Let's go back to fertilizers. We're good on questions so far?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, organic fertilizers again.
Oh, tardigrades.
Tardigrades. That's it. Tardigrades.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They're so cute.
The tardigrades are adorable. Yeah, if you're lucky, you'll get to see those. The tardigrades are kind of everywhere. So organic fertilizers, again, there's different types of fertilizers. We're going to just go through a few of them. I'm not going to talk about them all because it's too impossible. There's so many of them. But in general, there's a few different types. There's manure-based organic fertilizers. There's composted materials. There's a lot of organic fertilizers that are just byproducts of industries. And some of them are mined, and some of the mined ones they're not the kind of mines that cause a lot of terrible disturbance in our ecosystems. Well, we'll talk about that. We've talked about this in the classes before, but some people here, maybe I don't know who's new or not, but just a quick thing: NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These are the three numbers that are on your fertilizers. The first number is nitrogen, which is responsible for mostly like green growth, or just in general the growing of a plant. Phosphorus is responsible for root development and for flowering and fruiting or reproductive activity. And then potassium sort of does a whole bunch of things. It's sort of like a supporter of nitrogen and phosphorus, and in general it keeps plants healthy. We don't really have a lack of potassium in our soil. The first two numbers are really the most important ones that we need to worry about, nitrogen and phosphorus. And then there's micronutrients, which are not part of the NPK, and that's something else you need to think about. This is iron, magnesium, boron, and all those like micro nutrients. Why are they important, and why do we have to consider them? So they have a lot of functions in our cells. And when I say our cells, I mean every living organism. Where does that come from? Well, if you were to take a cell and look at the fluid inside of a cell, and not only just inside the cell, but look into your blood system and look at your plasma, the non-red stuff in your, not the blood, not the cells, but the liquid portion of your blood, the plasma. What does it most resemble in the world? If you look at the whole, our whole universe, like what does it represent more than anything? It mostly resembles seawater. And what I mean is like the combination of micronutrients that are found in your every cell in your body. The closest substance in the entire world is seawater. And why is that? Because we evolved all from these little creatures that evolved out of the ocean. And all you really are is just an aquarium trying to live outside of the ocean. So every living thing is that. Every living thing it came from the ocean. And so because we evolved from that, we need those nutrients. And that's, of course, the same with plants. And so where do we get those nutrients from? The ocean, and then old ocean deposits that are found in soil that we dig up and use to add to our soil. So that's where it comes from when our soil has already been destroyed, which is something that humans are very good at. Let's go through some organic fertilizers that you might find in the market. And I'm not putting my favorite ones up here. I just kind of randomly picked out some to just give you a quick rundown of some types of fertilizers that you might see. So, and again, I hate the word fertilizer. These are soil foods, right? So alfalfa meal is something that you often find, especially in agriculture areas. Of course, you find them in a lot of the organic fertilizer companies have this stuff. It's just alfalfa that's been ground up. It's somewhat slow release, and it's something that you add in for mostly nitrogen, but there's a little phosphorus in there too. People grow alfalfa as a cover crop too because it works with microbes in the soil to add more nitrogen. So there's one. Cottonseed meal, a byproduct of the cotton industry. Again, higher nitrogen, slow to medium release. It's acidic, which is really nice because, again, we have very alkaline soil. We live in the desert, which there's been a lot of shallow rain over a long period of time, and some of you even live in a place that used to be seabed, so it's very saline or alkaline soil. So anything that's acidic is going to help combat that a lot. Also, our water is extremely alkaline too, so that's anything that's acidic is usually going to be pretty good. Rock phosphate has a lot of phosphorus. It's slow though, so it takes a long time to release. But this is something you can add to your soil, and then you're adding compost and all this other stuff will make the phosphorus a little bit more available as it acidifies and as it creates these pockets of life in your soil structure. It'll make that rock phosphate a little more active and a little more available, but it is slow release, especially on its own. Earthworm castings is a type of manure, and we've talked about that. But just to get an idea of its makeup, it's heavier on phosphorus. It does have some nitrogen and potassium as well. But it is nice though. It's nice and balanced. So it's a nice thing to add to your soil. Green sand, a lot of people will look at it, and it has really low numbers in things that we really care about. It has some potassium, but that's not something we usually worry about that much. But that is something you add for micronutrients because it is basically from old seabeds. So it's full of micronutrients. It also helps soil retain water very well. So if you have soil that doesn't do that, like sandy soil, it's pretty good for that. Soybean meal is high nitrogen, slow to medium release. Powdered fish meal is actually a favorite thing of mine. Really nutrient rich and fairly able to fairly available. It can be a little smelly when you first apply it, but that's I kind of like the smell of fish. I use liquid fish emulsion in the nursery sometimes, and that's at our house too, and at the places where we grow things, and of course the retail space too. And so the nursery will smell like the ocean for a day or two, which I don't mind. I have fond memories of the ocean. Azomite, again, old ocean bottom, basically. It's basically all micronutrients, and it's slow to medium release. It's more available when there's oh, that really affected the light. That was crazy. It's really a lot more available when you have a higher organic material in your soil. Are there questions?
No.
Did you look in here too?
Yes.
Okay. So humic substances. Let's talk about that. This is a different thing, and it's not a fertilizer or soil food per se. I mean, it is. What you're adding in is humic substances. So I kind of talked about this. They're stabilized compounds. Basically, when everything's been broken down in soil, the very end result is usually humic substances, and they're these natural polymers that can't be broken down any further, but they're still organic, and they act as they make nutrients available to plants. They act like chelators. If you ever buy certain types of fertilizer like chelated iron, that means that the iron is more available to the plant. There's a lot of organic stuff that you could put in the soil, but it's just not quickly available. Humic substances in soil, and this includes compost, which has some humic substances in it, make nutrients available to plants. And in more ways than one. They ionize nutrients, but they also almost act like they almost funnel the nutrients to the roots of plants. So there's products out there that you can find. Most of these products are mined, and they come from old organic substances that were anaerobic actually, but old seabed and swamp, like primordial swamps that have been unearthed. There's this a ton of humic substances, these polymers that are available, and you can add them to your soil. So what is humus? I kind of explained that, but basically, like your goal when you're making your soil happier is you're trying to create a system where there's these polymers have been created that really deliver a lot to the plants. It's not just about feeding plants; it's about creating conditions in the soil that make the soil a safe place for plants. Not safe; it's a place where plants thrive. Sorry, I got this weird sun on my face because the sun's coming down, but hope I don't look too evil. So this is this is how it's naturally formed, of course. In in natural systems, in our desert it's different, but it happens here too, where you have organic material. We talked about this succession, and it just happens over a long period of time. Now, there's not as much of this humic substance available even in an old growth forest is not as prevalent as it is in these mined areas, and so sometimes you can get them. Sometimes we get them from compost. Compost can only make so much of this kind of thing, but it does make humic substances. But the things like leonardite is from an old swamp. I think the first one of the main places it comes out of is like Colorado or Utah or something like that. It was an old swamp, and years of like anaerobic activity, but breaking down organic substances to its very, very unbreakable down point, and it just laid under the ground for a long time, and now we sort of mine it. This is a leonardite mine right here, and it's basically on the surface, and they just kind of dig it up, and it's black. But this, I know I talked about black not being the greatest color because it means anaerobic activity, but that it's overstating it that anaerobic activity is not good in an organic system. It actually is good in some places, in some ways, but not in your compost pile. You don't want too much of it in there. The formation of leonardite, though, basically this is one place where you can get a bunch of humic substances aside from composting and all that. It's a quicker way, but you don't need to do this. It's just something to think about. Finally, I just wanted to say that everything that we know about all this stuff is, bless you,
thank you,
is fairly new. We're just discovering this stuff. Of course, we've always we did organic farming long before we did inorganic farming. But inorganic farming and using synthetic fertilizers and pesticides is sort of new. But we didn't know what we were doing necessarily. We just knew it was good. We knew that when we left a bunch of crap over on this part of our yard, that the next year everything there grew 10 times taller than everything else. Actually, I did that as a kid. I remember I threw a bunch of I was kind of composting, but I didn't know what I was doing, and I threw a bunch of material in the unkept part of the yard, and I forgot about it. And then next year, I noticed there was grass growing, and then the part where I had the pile of food and stuff that I threw there was way taller than everything else, and that was like such an eye opener for me when I saw that. So we've always known this stuff, but we don't know why. We're just still learning. In this picture, actually, which is the final picture in this slide show, I think, is what they call cryptogamic soil, and this is desert stuff. This is more evidence about why the desert is old growth forest. This takes a long time to be created. It's a matrix of microbes, not unsimilar to lichen, lichen is not an organism. It's a matrix of organisms. Same with slime molds too. There's a lot of what we used to think of as like a separate organism, and we realize like, oh no, it's really it's a matrix of organisms that live together. So anyway, cryptogamic soil is that. You don't see a lot of this anymore because it's very delicate and we've stomped everywhere and destroyed it all. So, but it looks like a crust, and it's full of life. And the plants actually tend to do really well around it. And there are some people who are experimenting with trying to create cryptogamic soil on purpose, but we have a lot to learn about it. But the point of me bringing it up is that we are still learning about all this. We don't know everything that we're doing. There's a lot of plants that we don't know even how to grow because we've only started thinking about the other organisms. We were so obsessed with just growing that plant. A good example, orchids. People love orchids, and orchids have this really intense relationship with microbes. There's some that can live without that, and they wither away at Sprouts and places like that where people buy them, and it goes to its slow death. But orchids actually have a very complex relationship with microbes, and I'm talking about both terrestrial and epiphytic orchids. So epiphytic orchids are the ones that live in trees, and terrestrial orchids are the ones that live in the ground. In Arizona, we have several species of terrestrial orchids, mostly in the mountains, and some in the grasslands. But we can't grow them on purpose. We don't know how to because we don't know a lot about microbes. It's the same thing with a lot of our native ferns. There's some that we've been able to grow, and we actually have one at our house. But they're hard to grow because we don't know a lot about those relationships. And so that's something we're going to keep learning. And so keep your ears open. Like, you don't know everything. You never do. And you'll learn more and more about, growing things this pro-biology way. But in general, I do just want you to think about the fact that you're always creating ecology. You're not just, feeding a plant and making it grow in this isolated environment. Like, that's not how things work. And so I hope I've answered your questions and stuff. Well, there's probably some questions here.
I've got a couple questions.
Yeah, so now we're in the question and answer time. So any questions you have, please just fire away. You can text them on the number down there, or just ask on YouTube.
Somebody asked, can you drink effluent water if it's been boiled?
Huh. I don't know. I mean, if in a survival situation, sure, but maybe not. So affluent water has things other than biological things that are not good. Just think about it, all the crap that people pour down drains, right? People dump their car oil, and I mean, humans are awful. Like, we just throw crap everywhere. So like, there's stuff in affluent water that it's stuff besides the microbial. Like, you can boil affluent water and then get rid of the microbes that are a problem, but you're not going to get rid of the chemistry of that water that's a problem. So that's something you have to filter out, or use reverse osmosis or something like that to clean it. So
somebody also says, are septic system leach fields a good place to grow? I think so.
Yeah, let's talk about poop. First of all, septic fields are, septic means no oxygen, by the way, or it implies no oxygen. It's anaerobic, but usually above a septic area, you have really good growth. Don't put a giant tree in there, because a giant tree the roots will go in there and kind of mess things up. But smaller things are probably pretty all right to put in that situation. It all depends on your septic system, but yeah.
I've heard um, I've heard marijuana grows great above a septic system.
There you go.
Stanley wants to know, you gave a time like 12 to 20 hours for aerating compost tea. He's also heard 36 hours.
Yeah.
How can you tell when it's done?
It's not an exact science, and so, or it is an exact science, depending on how you want to deal with that. So, what am I saying? I'm saying that you got to play around, and it all depends on what your compost is like, what you're feeding. And that's something I didn't exactly elaborate on. I just talked about using molasses and kelp. But as I got into making compost tea, I started playing around with other ingredients too, because I didn't just learn a formula and then applied it. I actually was taught how to look at the microbes, and so I started using things like alfalfa meal and other organic fertilizers, basically. And I put them. I played around to see like what if I did this. And the results, there's two ways to track your results. One is just applying the stuff to the plants. But the other thing is if you do get a microscope and start looking at it, you can see what you're encouraging. So you'll notice that some foods encourage more fungal development and some foods encourage more protozoan development, or a lot of foods encourage more bacterial development. So in general, like, you don't have to go crazy over this, because anything you do like this, all this stuff that I'm telling you to do, even if you do a half-assed job doing it, you're going to be improving things. Unless you do something really wrong and you add swampy, diarrhea-smelling stuff to it. And even then it would probably be fine. But, in general, it's you got to play around. When it comes to timing, the way that we used to deal with it when I did this stuff as my job is at various points during the brew process, I would take several samples and look through the microscope and see what's happening. And you would see spikes in activity. You would see like a spike where like this is the best time to grab this. And I used to track everything, so I would see that I put so much amount of molasses and so much amount of kelp into this mix, and at this certain period, I would have my prime time to use that tea. But you're never going to have it exactly right. And also, just something to remember is that the one thing that's very hard to control in this is the compost. Compost can be so different every time. And so depending on how you made that compost and what it went through, you'll have different results. So that's something to think about too. But just play around, and it's fun. And especially if you can get into looking through the microscope.
Can you use leaves and plant matter from potentially toxic plants in compost?
Yes. And another thing I want to de-emphasize that's always emphasized in composting, they say don't use citrus, don't use dairy or meat. Yeah, don't use a lot of that stuff. But if there's a little bit in there, it's actually not a bad thing, and sometimes it has benefits. And the whole thing about poisonous leaves, none of them are poisonous when it comes. Eucalyptus leaves actually are great in compost. Again, you have a lot of them, they're not that great. But and if that's your main source, then it's probably, there are a lot of terpenes in there that are not, they're antimicrobial. But some of it in there is not a bad thing. Salt cedars you might stay away from because salt is not great for biology. And so in salt cedars, the way that they survive in deserts, they're not from here, they're from Africa, but some people have those giant salt cedars in their yards, and you'll notice that not a lot of things grow under those things. It's because they suck up the salts out of the soil and they deposit it on the outsides of their leaves, and then when they drop all those leaves, they make a layer of salt on the ground. So I wouldn't use salt cedar, although a couple shovelfuls would actually be pretty good. if you mix it in really well. Anything can be all right if you mix it in really well. But um, yeah, again, it's just like trying to emphasize certain ingredients and making what you're aiming at is the mix. Like, don't get too caught up on, oh, I put some, there was a little bit of meat that was in that dish that I scraped off into the compost pile. Like, now my compost is ruined. No, it's not. Actually, it's probably a good thing. So a little bit of those kind of things are fine. Just don't emphasize it. Don't have a lot of meat in there, or a lot of dairy, or a lot of citrus, or a lot of eucalyptus, and you'll be fine. Oleanders, people always ask about. They're fine. Actually, they're great compost. Yeah, a lot of the plants that people have prejudices about being poisonous, euphorbias and stuff like that, they're poisonous to us. They're not poisonous to many other things. My tortoise loves euphorbia. So, but anyway.
Thomas wants to know, should I spend a season growing just sunflowers and beans to fix my soil? My garden bed is a mix of the crap soil in my yard, my compost, and commercial soil.
It all depends on what you want to do, but yeah, if you want to do not so much sunflowers. I mean, sunflowers are okay, but like beans, legumes are great. So and you can make it something that you can use too. Teparies is a really great, delicious, and very easy to grow native crop, and really good for the soil. So you can grow a whole bed of teparies, and have the result being that you got teparies. Yeah, legumes especially. Legumes have a relationship with microbes where they can take the nitrogen out of the soil, and these mycorrhizae, the organisms that live in and amongst the roots of legumes, can convert that nitrogen into something that plants can use and put it in the soil. And so legumes are the main family of plants that do this. There's some other families, but legumes are the main one you want to think about. So like any kind of bean, and of course all our native legumes. Legume is the family Fabaceae, so that includes mesquites and acacias and stuff. But when it comes to your garden, in the wintertime you can grow fava and garbanzo beans. In the summer you can grow just about all the other beans. In the spring and fall you can grow sugar and snap beans. The only thing you got to watch out for is don't grow beans with something that doesn't want a lot of nitrogen, like root crops, carrots and beets and radishes and things like that don't want a lot of nitrogen. You'll get a lot of green growth and you won't get any carrot. So that's the only thing that you have to worry about with that.
That's it.
All right. So unless anyone has any other questions, I think that will be it for this week. I hope that you learned something. This was an important subject, and that's why I really hope that I did answer all your questions. When I learned about Elaine Ingham, she wrote a book, by the way, go find it. It's called Teaming with Microbes, and that book changed my life because it had something that I always thought about. I'm an ecologist. More so than I am a horticulturist. So that means that I study plants and nature more. And I've always suspected that in horticulture we were missing a huge thing, especially back in the 90s. I just felt like we were missing something. And I did think about microbes a lot. And then I came across that book, and it changed my life. I realized, like, that's what we're trying to do is make... when you're growing plants, you're not really growing plants, you're growing microbes, and the microbes take care of the plants. So, and again, it's not even just in the root system of the plants, it's also on the surfaces of plants too, and so, it changed everything. And I realized that, and this is something that people haven't even taken advantage of yet. I'll give a good example. People who are really into growing orchids, if you know any orchid people, they're freaks. And when I say they're freaks, like they're collectors and they have these amazing collections and they spend so much money growing orchids. And all of them, they do it very toxic. I know I don't know, actually, I don't know anybody who grows orchids organically. Um, but a lot of them have trouble growing certain orchids and they don't know how to do it. And that's something that, if an orchid grower is watching this, you might start thinking about raising microbes and trying to identify the microbes that the orchids depend on, and then you can raise them in a compost tea if you experiment. So this is something that we haven't taken enough advantage of. This is all we're barely scratching the surface when it comes to understanding biology. So we've just been fumbling in the dark, but we're starting to learn.
Was that the book?
Yeah, Teaming with Microbes. Yep.
Okay.
So Katie is posting the title of the book, and that book, by the way, is about Elaine Ingham's work, but it's actually written by this guy Jeff. And there's actually 2 other books too. There's Teaming with Nutrients or something like that, and then there's one about fungus. And all 3 books are really great, but really the Teaming with Microbes is a really good book. It is a little heavy on pushing the whole compost tea thing, which is like what all these people are into, and that's fine. But it's really what I want you to take away from reading that is this whole concept of being pro biology and raising good microbes. So good microbes that make good things. I guess that's it. No more questions. So thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll see you next week maybe.